Is anybody listening? Well, when it comes to the government, the overwhelming majority of Americans say no. 77% of voters say government does not pay enough attention to the voters. We're examining your thoughts and perspectives today on The Scott Rasmussen Show. Welcome to The Scott Rasmussen Show. I'm Scott, and joining me today is Edie Hill. Good morning, Edie.
Good morning, Scott. Great to see you again, and so happy to see all of you joining us, too. Today, we're going to explore more of the differences in opinion between everyday Americans and the elite 1%. Plus, we have a special opportunity for you to join the conversation with us. Let your voice be heard. Now, though, it's time for Scott's Thoughts. So what is on your mind this week?
Most of today's political discussion around race and ethnicity is built on a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of American history. You know, the discussion usually starts with an implied view that until very recently, America was nothing more than a homogeneous white society. As the narrative goes, only in the last few decades has our nation experienced any level of serious diversity. But that's a completely false representation of our history. The reality is we don't see the diversity of the past because we live in a mainstream that they created. What do I mean by that? Well, if you went back to the end of World War II when the baby boomers were being created, America was dominated by a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant community. We called them WASPs. Poles, Jews, Italians, Catholics, they were outsiders. They were not even considered white. They were not part of a homogeneous society. If you go back even further to the mid-1800s up to the early 1900s, there were massive waves of Irish immigrants who entered the country. And to be clear, they weren't always welcomed by polite society, by white society of the time. My grandpa's parents were among those who came over. And they were certainly not considered white, and being Catholic, well, that was not welcome in polite society. I know about this a little bit because my grandparents were not allowed to date. My grandpa, Irish Catholic, my grandmother was an Episcopalian white woman, and they had to elope. And in fact, the discrimination was so strong in those days that after they eloped and came home, they didn't have the nerve to tell their parents what they had done. They lived in separate homes for the first week of their marriage, and when they finally confessed, they were disowned by both families for about a decade. Ultimately, of course, all of these groups, Catholics and different ethnicities, became part of the American mainstream. We look at it as a homogeneous society, but those living through it didn't experience it that way. They just had a different understanding of what diversity looked like, what differences were important. And to be clear, this has always been the story of America. It goes all the way back to even before the Declaration of Independence created our nation. The very first Continental Congress met in 1774. Today, it would be viewed as nothing more than a bunch of old white Christian men. And they did find a little common ground. When they got together, the first thing they agreed on was to open the session with a prayer. But there was a difficulty. The colonists in those days included Quakers from Pennsylvania, Catholics from Maryland, Anglicans from the South, Puritans from the Northeast, and more. So there was a big fight about who should lead the prayer. These groups had never worshiped together. So ultimately, it took a compromise by one of the leading revolutionaries, Sam Adams, to resolve the situation. Now, Adams' quote is that I am no bigot. I can hear a prayer from a gentleman of piety and virtue who is a friend to this country. Now, Adams was also a political activist, and he made sure that as a Northeasterner, he proposed an Anglican to bring the South into some unity. The prayer did have a unifying impact on that first Continental Congress and led ultimately to the world that we know today. Ultimately, we're in a situation where future generations will look back on us and say, wow, they really considered that racial and ethnic diversity is so important. Instead, what they will see is a mainstream that this generation has created. They will look back on the time that we're living through as a time that was lacking diversity. And of course, they will have new divisions to think about and fight about. Those are my thoughts for this week.
That is amazing. That really does explain so much about our country. I'm Presbyterian because the Catholic Church ironically refused to marry my mother, who was Catholic, to a Protestant. And now it's sort of come full circle. My oldest daughter just got married. She is Presbyterian Jewish and married a Quaker Hindu. That, in my opinion, is modern love and modern life in America.
In my family, actually, both sets of grandparents had a Catholic married to a Protestant. So that was part of the change.
We are radicals, aren't we?
We are radicals. And the point is, though, that we don't appreciate these differences because it wouldn't be discussed today in the same way. But the truth is, my grandparents were married 100 years ago, and I'm still feeling the impact of their story. When I hear about denominational disputes, I'm like, no way, don't do that.
Yeah. I think that there's got to be tolerance that comes out of having that kind of, difference and experience in your background. And
Sam Adams, by the way, tapped into it right away. Yes, he had his own views, but he was willing to listen to somebody else. That's what got the First Continental Congress together, and that's what led to a unifying prayer and ultimately to our nation.
And then he created the beer.
That's right.
Once a nation of strictly divided groups, we've become a melting pot of religions and nationalities. We identify with a common culture. And the nation is not as divided as it seems. But there is a group whose opinions and perspectives differ from the majority of fellow Americans. You've heard us talk about the elite 1% and what makes them unique. Today, we have got some pretty jarring contrasts with their responses to questions on hot topic buttons. So Scott is here, and what has your research found about their core beliefs?
Well, let's start with a reminder of who they are.
Okay.
People with a postgraduate degree, people who live in densely populated urban areas. We're talking 10,000 people per square mile or more, Manhattan. And they make more than $150,000 a year.
What do they think when they take a look at issues that the rest of us do?
Well, the core beliefs that they have start off different. 69% of the politically obsessed elites, and these are the ones who talk politics all the time, they think we have too much individual freedom in America. The rest of America thinks there's not enough. But among this group, 7 out of 10 say there's too much individual freedom. 89% trust the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. Now, we talked last week, only 22% of voters have that much trust. I think the difference is these people are the government, or they know the government. It's not a deep state.
They feel like they're part of it.
That's
they're part
right.
of that in-group.
It's a fraternity. Lots of different ways of looking at this, but let's start with, does the government pay enough attention to voters? 9% of voters say, you know what, they pay too much attention to us. We want those elites to decide things for us. Overwhelmingly, though, 77%, 8 out of 10 voters say, the government doesn't pay enough attention. We hear this all the time.
It's like they pay attention to the things you really don't want them sticking their nose into, and they couldn't care less about the things that really matter to your everyday life.
That's right. And part of the challenge, though, is the politically obsessed elites have a different view, a plurality. 46% of them say the problem is the government is paying too much attention to the voters. Only 32% say not enough. This is a core problem. If a leadership group is saying we don't need to pay attention to voters, that tells you something's going wrong.
And a big difference between those two.
Yeah.
So what about kids and control over their education?
Big hot button issue, obviously, one that gets a lot of coverage. Only 15% of voters think that parents have too much control over their kids' education. We hear about this other group all the time in the news. 6 out of 10 voters saying, no, we don't have enough of a say in our children's education. We want more choice. We want to work with teachers. We want more input. It's not how the elites see it. 50% of this group says, guess what? Parents have too much control over their kids' education. Only 1 out of 6 here, 17%, say the parents don't have enough control. Wildly different views, again, on this issue. Most voters saying parents don't have enough control. Half of the elites saying, no, they have too much control.
Maybe that also is part of a breakdown by where the political elites, the elite 1%, are located, and whether or not they, what they see in their own school districts. Because in a lot of those cities, they're not even putting them in public schools; they're sticking them in private schools. Well, I think it depends on where you are, because that partnership, when you get a great partnership between a school with faculty, with teachers, staff, and parents, it can be wonderful.
Those partnerships are great, but I think what we see in a lot of data with the elite 1% is they're just not comfortable letting parents have a say in curriculum and in cultural decisions.
We're not as smart as they are. That's right.
There you go. There you go.
What about living in a community with guns?
Huge gap again, not a big surprise. Most voters would prefer to live in a community where guns are allowed. And Edie, I've been polling on this for a long time. Even after some horrible mass shooting stories come out, this always holds true. But the elites have a different view. This group, the politically obsessed elites, would prefer, 7 out of 10 of them, prefer to live in a community where guns are outlawed. Now, this goes back. They trust the government. They trust the legal process. They know the officials. And by the way, they could probably get out of trouble if they needed to. 3 out of 4 of this politically obsessed elite group say we should ban the private ownership of guns. I mean, we're talking a massive cultural divide here. And this is something we see pop up in lots of issues.
Yeah. What about working for the government? Noble? Altruistic?
Well, sometimes. You know, we asked voters, 17% say it's more honorable to work for the government than to work for a company in the private sector. Okay, 1 out of 6. What about the elites? 60% of the politically obsessed elites say that it is more comfortable or more honorable to work for the government than for a private company.
Don't get your hands dirty doing the people's business, you know, out in the field or in the stores or making the money.
Right.
What about college degrees?
We asked a question. This one shocked me. We asked a question, would America be better off if only people with a college degree were allowed to vote? 15% of voters say yes, 62% say no, things would get worse if we only had those college graduates voting. But among the elite 1%, the politically obsessed elites, 69% say it would be better for America if we didn't let people without a college degree vote. We only want degree voters.
So keep the plumbers, the electricians, all the people who do a lot of things for everybody every single day. Don't let them vote. That's the political elite, the 1%.
Right, because they know best.
Now it's time for rapid fire. So, Scott, what about the latest presidential polling?
Latest polling shows it's a toss-up in the popular vote. Our numbers among registered voters show it's 42% for Trump, 42% for Biden. By the way, if only people with a college degree could vote, Biden would be doing much better.
You know, honestly, that number kind of surprises me because of all the things that that Democrats have been talking about what's wrong with Biden, why he's not a good candidate. I would think that Trump would have been able to capitalize on that more in numbers like this. So why 42-42, do you think?
Well, the short answer is if you looked at Biden's job approval number, he should be trailing by 6, 8, 10 points in the polls. But you may have heard Donald Trump has a little bit of baggage. People are unhappy with some of his personal characteristics, the way he tweets. He's on trial for a bunch of things.
But he's been doing that for a while.
Right. And so that baggage is already baked in. And so that's kind of Biden's problem is his performance in office, and Trump's problem is he's Donald Trump with all the good and the bad that entails.
Now, last week we talked a bit about immigration. What about new immigration numbers? What are you seeing?
Voters say, we like the idea of deporting all the illegal immigrants. Most voters say that anyhow. Most voters also say, yeah, we'd be okay with creating a path to citizenship for people who have been here for a while. And when you ask about, well, what if you had a choice between the two? It's split right down the middle. What this tells us is people are really uncomfortable with the idea of just a blanket removal of all immigrants. You know, whilst they say it's okay, they're really concerned about those who've come over in more recent years.
A very different type of illegal immigrant.
Correct.
And you just get the sense of chaos, which I don't think I was oblivious to it, but it didn't feel the same. It didn't feel like the giant chaos that we have at the borders now.
Right, the chaos at the border and the idea of border security. And I like to actually separate that from immigration. Border security is a different issue, and it's something that voters are very concerned about, and they don't think the Biden administration is.
And in terms of creating a path to citizenship, that I think goes back to Americans. Most of us, come from immigrant families. I mean, at some point, and frequently not that far back, we were immigrants.
But that issue, first of all, there's an assumption of some legal process
Correct.
here that you've gone through. You know, when we try to break this down to illegal immigrants, there's several categories. Some, a big chunk actually, are people who had a visa to come here and simply overstayed it. Others are people who were allowed to enter and then were released into the country and told they had to come back for an asylum hearing.
I just don't get that. You know, if you think they're going to be deporting people, how can you just say, here's a ticket, like you went 5 miles over the speed limit? You know, come on back in 3 months.
And by the way, 7 out of 10 voters say if they don't show up, we should deport them. So again, there are different segments here, and we run into this a lot of time. You get into these vague discussions about what should you do with immigrants who are here illegally. Mm-hmm. It's never that simple.
Yeah. And let's turn back to the campus protests, because there continues to be a lot going on with, you know, college presidents being pushed aside and still encampments all over the place. What's happening there?
Well, 51% of voters say they think these protests have been initiated by outside forces. They're not based on deeply held beliefs of the students. Only 28% really think student beliefs are driving it. The Wall Street Journal did some reporting to back that up recently. People still overwhelmingly, I think this is a great thing, 78% say, of course they have the right to express their views. This is a free speech is part of who we are as Americans, but they do want to place limits on what's going on. And ultimately, what we find out is that through all of this, Joe Biden has managed to create a bit of a political mess for himself. What I'm going to tell you right now is quite a feat. Among American voters who say we should be supporting Israel, well, most of them think that Joe Biden disagrees with them. Among voters who say we should be supporting Hamas, most of them think Joe Biden disagrees with them. And among those who say we should stay out, most of them think Joe Biden disagrees with them. He's managed to alienate all of the segments of this on this particular issue.
Well, that is true talent. Stay tuned. When we come back, we've got an opportunity for you to join the conversation. We'll have that and more on The Scott Rasmussen Show. Welcome back to the Scott Rasmussen Show. Before the break, we learned that despite the controversy surrounding everything going on at the southern border, 61% of voters favor creating a path to citizenship. And now, for something new, we want to hear directly from you. We want you to be part of this conversation. So we invite you to scan the QR code that is showing right now on the lower part of your screen. It is going to take you to a page where you can submit your questions directly to the pollster extraordinaire himself, Scott Rasmussen. It's your opportunity to lend your voice to the topics and the conversations that we explore every week right here on the Scott Rasmussen Show. So speaking of the American voice, what's the feel about federal subsidies?
Well, it all depends on who's getting subsidized. 79% of voters say if an individual earns more than $1 million a year, they should not be eligible for any kind of federal benefits. And by the way, we get similar numbers on corporations with more than $1 billion of revenue, colleges that have more than $100 million in their endowment fund. People don't mind giving a helping hand to those in need, but they're really uncomfortable with helping the rich get a little richer.
And what about the number not to forget this week? What should we keep in mind?
The number not to forget this week, 77% of voters say the federal government doesn't pay enough attention to voters. And look, that is the core problem. It's not that the voters are the problem, it's that the government is not listening.